Okay, I want to go over the game Fischer versus Petrosian, played in 1971. It was a very important World Championship qualifier match for Fischer. He had demolished Taimanov 6-0, and he also beat Larsen 6-0. Before carrying on with the game though, let's have a quick look at the Barnet site's 1971. So we see here Taimanov, a little cartoon picture. You see here 6-0. And then the other 6-0, and now Petrosian. Here's a picture of Petrosian. So Fischer had 5 decisive games against Petrosian. He drew 3, and he actually lost 1 to Petrosian as well. So out of those 3 challenges, Petrosian gave Fischer the toughest match. But then the gates were open to play against Spassky. So anyway, back to the game. So Fischer playing white, he played e4 and Petrosian played c5, and now knight f3, e6, d4. This is all standard stuff. Now a6. So black is committing a couple pawns now to the light squares, weakening a bit the dark squares. Bishop d3. Now knight c6. So Petrosian is encouraging Fischer to play knight takes c6 because Petrosian wants the extra pawns in the centre. Now after d5 it looks as though white is giving black a comfortable game, but he plays now c4, which is a bit of an annoying move for black, because in this continuation black ends up with an isolated pawn, which is often a weakness in the end game. It's interesting to see how Fischer played against this isolated pawn, and if that's instructive for our own games. He played knight c3, and after bishop e7 we see now a very sharp move by Fischer. He plays queen a4 check, which is the disruptive check. Let's examine if the casual bishop d7 had been played. Fischer may have just played here a move like queen h4, which makes it a bit unpleasant for black to castle kingside if there's an automatic attack. For example, castles bishop g5. Or in fact here, Fischer has knight takes d5 as a tactic. So it's unpleasant a bit, this continuation for black. Petrosian is very resourceful. He plays queen d7 with an amazing idea actually, that bishop b5, even though it would win the exchange for white, would give Petrosian an interesting compensation for the loss of the exchange. For example, just castling here, and you can see now that it might get unpleasant for Fischer if his queen's stuck on a8, because there's moves like bishop b7 coming up. So here we might, for example, see maybe bishop d6 pointing resources at white's king. So black would have some compensation. Fischer didn't go in for this though. He didn't mind the queen's simplification. He played, in fact, just rook e1. So he's trying to play the position with minimal counterplay for black. Petrosian doesn't mind, though, the exchange of queens. But he does have that lingering isolated pawn weakness. Now here we see one plan after another where Fischer systematically increases his advantage. It's very instructive. First he plays bishop e3 with the idea of swapping off this defensive dark squared bishop. So after castles bishop c5, and now a second plan to establish a knight outpost on c5 and also increase the presence of this 2-to-1 pawn majority on the queen side. So he might have a dangerous pawn later, but also there's a horrible amount of pressure on this poor isolated a6 pawn. So that's why black's forced to play very passively now with bishop c8. So how does Fischer increase the torture here? He's accumulated some small advantages. He plays f3, so that denies this knight outpost, and also it means that white's king can crawl to the centre, or maybe to the king side if necessary. Rook to a7, very passive looking move. Now king f2 is coming up. But we see here a very cunning continuation first. Rook e5. Petrosian played bishop d7 because Fischer was going to play rook e1 with strong domination on that e-file, maybe g4 and g5 later. And now Fischer played knight takes d7 here, which shocked a lot of grandmasters at the time, because it's giving up that beautifully placed knight outpost. But Fischer has the idea that he can evade now on the 7th rank later. Black's in a very tied up position because there's a threat now of rook c6. Petrosian was so worried about this, he let Fischer play now rook c7. So after rook d6 he's allowing rook c7, but there's still a lot of lingering pressure. After knight d7 he plays rook e2. Now g6. Now we see king f2, so the king is preparing perhaps to come to the queen side or the centre. If it came to the queen side later, then it might support this 2-to-1 pawn majority. Petrosian now plays h5, which is a very interesting move, gaining some space on the king side. Before moving this rook to say c2, Fischer now closes that e5 square away from the knight. He plays f4, and Petrosian plays h4 now. Perhaps he wanted to discourage g3 from white, so he could take and then maybe king g7 and rook h8. But I'm just speculating here. He plays king f3 now, with the idea of simply king g4, which would harass that h-pawn. So Petrosian is forced into another weakening move now to stop this king g4. He plays f5. Now Fischer moves his king towards the centre. So he's built up some more concrete advantages here. This isolated pawn is blockaded beautifully by this bishop, which is also attacking this isolated pawn here. The rooks are both very aggressive. This rook's still horribly on the 7th rank. So white has all the positional trumps. After knight b6, white's increasing the positional trumps, but being aware of the tactical implications now of having both rooks liable to be attacked by this knight fork. First he plays check, and now rook b7, not worrying about either knight takes b4 or knight takes f4, because there's a very nice tactical idea. If, as the game played, Fischer played bishop c4, and here the idea is that after white is now threatening rook h7, and if rook f6, well, let's have a look. Knight h5, for example, rook h7, with the idea of just rook h8 mating. Rook f6, you'll see here that white has bishop f7 check. So that's why this bishop is so destructive on this diagonal and helps these rooks on the 7th rank. So if we have a quick overview of this game, it was very nicely positionally played. Right from the start, Fischer avoided the complications resulted from trying to win material with bishop b5 here. Instead, he casually just increased his small advantages, allowing the exchange of queens. His next strategic plan was to exchange off this defensive dark squared bishop, gaining access for white on these dark squares. His next plan was this knight outpost reinforced on c5, and also the 2-to-1 pawn majority. He now played f3, giving the potential for the king to come in the centre, preparing for the endgame. The rook e5 was also a nice move, with the threat of rook e1 just establishing dominance on the e-file, which provoked bishop d7. And here was the most elegant controversial decision, where Fischer gave up this beautiful knight outpost because he wanted this pressure with his rooks and the bishop instead. So he translated one weakness for black into another weakness, which he could more easily exploit. So this c-file has concrete targets, namely the a6 pawn. Once he had this rook on the 7th, it was really downhill for black. Especially when the other rook joined it, it became utterly decisive in this position, with either knight takes b4 or knight takes f4 being hopeless because of this crushing bishop c4 idea. So it really was a positional masterpiece, this game, avoiding complications, playing on the dark squares, and really indirectly exploiting this isolated pawn with all the stuff he played to increase his other advantages. Beautiful stuff by Fischer.